Good afternoon. We're live. Casey Story Editorial Board. I'm Toriano Porter. I'm joined today by my colleague Melinda Henneberger. And today we have a special guest, Jackson County Prosecutor Jean Peters Baker. Prosecutor, thanks for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'll get right to it. Yesterday, there was a rally at your courthouse, but you were able to put out a statement. Can you talk about a little bit about what your statement was in reply to that rally at your courthouse yesterday?
Yeah, sure. I think the group that came by yesterday we're talking about individual cases, but I think if we kind of took it the step further about what they're concerned about, their concern is, what is your process for reviewing old cases? You know, how do you go back and correct an error? And beyond that, I think the next place that prosecutors ought to go is to look at excessive sentences, because, you know, things have changed, right? The way we look at cases, it has pretty fundamentally changed. There are, for those two areas, looking at wrongful convictions and looking at excessive sentences, there are some real deficiencies in the law that, though prosecutors have the continued obligation and duty to oversee those, we actually don't have the power to do that. So excessive sentences resides with the governor through commutations of sentences, and that's a pretty rare circumstance in my tenure. Though I had one where I asked for a commutation that was granted by Governor Brighton's on, I think, his last day in office, or last couple of days in office. At the same time, I was reviewing him, so it was awkward. It happens how it happens. I was a burglar that I felt like got a ridiculously large sentence that more than paid for his crime. And then the other process is largely with the Attorney General's office. There's a very small avenue for the local prosecutor to step in, and that's when DNA shows it's a wrongful conviction. But otherwise, it really resides out of our authority. So there's a lot of tension there, and there is a need for a law change. And Kim Gardner out of St. Louis is one of those. She's pushing that right now with the case that she has. Right.
Okay, thank you for addressing that. Criminal justice reform has been hot here in Jackson County and Kansas City. As you know, the last 10 to 12 days, there's been protests. What is the Jackson County prosecutor, and what role do you play in the criminal justice reform?
Well, you know, at the police level, very little, but my voice about what, you know, kind of what I think about it, if anyone cares. But for my own office, we have deeply engaged in reform, and so much so that I think it does cause some tension with my office and my local police departments at times. But I have engaged in the type of reform that I think is, it's well researched, it's thoughtful, it's not reactionary, and it is really meant to address the deficiencies that are embedded in this criminal justice system. And as you know, many of those are racial injustices that are just embedded into the system. So it's my job to try and peel those back out and figure out how we can better address this system fairly.
Okay. Now, I understand that the mayor of Kansas City, Mayor Quinn Lucas, asked your office and several other agencies to look into allegations of excessive force during these protests here. Where does your office stand with that regard? Where's that investigation?
Well, that has been quite the undertaking. You know, it was basically, I think, 4 nights of, you know, a really strong police presence and a strong police response. And protesters also responded strongly. And so, you know, I mean, we're going to continue to look at all protests that have happened, but those first 4 nights have probably caused months of work and months of review. So the only way I could really kind of figure out how to get my hands around it was to establish the website that said, let us know, send us your video, let us look at it. I will write a report, you know, kind of once I get my hands around some of that, and we're able to do some testimonials with people, watch the video, and we're also sharing all that material with the FBI, and we'll see what role they're willing to engage in altogether on that. But so far, they've been a good partner.
Since you play such a big role in the criminal justice system here, how do you think we should start reimagining policing in Kansas City? Where would you start?
Where would I start? I think, there seems to be such a disconnect between the warrior police officer versus the guardian police officer. And if we need to find methods that get us to that pathway that community members also see that police officers can be guardians, and that should be their primary role rather than the warrior. And so the way, there's a lot of ways to do that. I think the first is a very broad and systematic community policing. I'd want something like that to be overseen by academics that that have done this other places, know what real true community policing is, rather than this you just put a police officer in a particular area and neighborhood leaders have their cell phone and they can call with problems. That's not the kind of level of community policing that we need. It would be a very programmatic and a kind of a systems change. So that's one. I know that this has not worked in some areas, but it has worked in others, and that would be procedural justice training for everyone that works on a department, top down, and everyone in between. And that might get people much closer to the not serving so much in that warrior role, but in a role as the guardian. I think building trust, however you can do it. Another way to build trust is that you don't investigate yourself. Investigate yourself. When you have allegations of wrongdoing, you really just have to show the public you trust the neutral process that you've put in place, and you're going to give that to someone else to do.
Why has that been so hard here in Kansas City and Jackson County?
It's not hard in Jackson County. There are many departments inside Jackson County that do this, but Kansas City seems much more reluctant to do it. I think it is harder for Kansas City because of their size. So it's hard to find another like entity that can pick up that work for them. So I don't presume that there's a quick and easy solution to this.
You have criticized Chief Smith and said that it looked like he was covering up for some of his officers in not giving you these probable cause statements. And then you yourself have been criticized, and people, protesters have said, you are complicit in the system you're criticizing. So do you feel at this point that Chief Smith can be the change agent that's needed?
I guess I'm not sure about that. And I guess, Melinda, I'd also say, I guess you really want the FOP to issue another really angry press release at Jean Petersbaker. So however I answer that, I'm going to get an angry press release from the FOP. I think the answer is this, though. I want my community to believe that their police department works for them, and that that trust just has to be there. And to be a real change agent means you have to be upfront, you have to be extremely transparent, and you have to be willing to hear people's critique. And that remains to be seen. I think we'll see what happens in the days going forward, and maybe even weeks going forward. But we're really at a crossroads, I think, in determining where we go next. And I really hope citizens really get a chance to weigh in on their own on this own process.
Prosecutor, you mentioned the first 4 days of these protests were pretty intense. From your office and where you sit, what were some of the things that stood out in those first 4 days that concerned you as it relates to excessive force and the law?
So I have the benefit of, that wasn't the first series of protests that I have experienced, on behalf of the city. 2014 was a very tense time. That was Michael Brown was in August of 2014, and then the decision was November of 2015, if my memory strikes correctly.
Mhm.
And I remember watching in horror, at that town erupt, knowing that, we were just a half a step from that. And then it did come here. It came more in 2015, and then we had the presidential election of 2016, and it was rough then. I mean, I don't want to understate it. It was, in 2016, we had at that same Mill Creek Park, we would have Black Lives Matter there at the same time as 3%ers and another third group that were all sort of, not on the same team.
I was on the breaking news beat at the time. I remember that. It was pretty intense.
It was really intense and it was scary, but I have to give credit to where it is due, and that same police department managed that impeccably well. I was just really amazed at how they would proactively go meet with organizers. They would work out solutions. They kind of served a little bit as the mediator at times. And even in 2015, when the same protest for the same thing, it was about excessive use of force by police officers. I remember Daryl Forte leading the protest. He led it. I mean, he created a parade route. He handed out bottles of water. It was just a really different approach. And maybe the times have changed, and I don't know, but I've been able to, I lived through those experiences as well and saw how very different it was in those days.
Right. And so when you saw what happened the first 4 days of this protest in 2020, what was kind of your thoughts? Were you appalled at what some of the things you saw?
I was, of course. I still am rather shocked that everybody was there for the same reason. So sometimes people show up to protest for different reasons, but not this time. You could have asked a 7-year-old kid that was there with his mom, or you could have asked any person, why are you here? And they would have told you, we are here to protest excessive use of force by police officers. And then it appeared you could just look right over their shoulders and see, sort of the wall of power by police that was there. And I understand what police were trying to do, but it seemed just the response caused a tinderbox. Rather than kind of adding a little bit more space and time and sort of bringing the tempo down, it brought it up. And that's my quick view of it. And maybe once I learn more, we will do a lot of work here. Like I said, this is probably going to take this office at least weeks and maybe months to kind of untangle some of what happened and why was it so bad? I've just not experienced that before in Kansas City. So it was a new learning experience for me too, that it could go so differently in such a short period of time in between.
Right.
After that, there was some de-escalation, and that people think was very helpful. Did you see that, and what led to that de-escalation, do you think?
I'm not sure what led to it yet, but I did see it too. I think that was probably by night 5. We started to see there was just more added space, and sort of the overall mood was just taken down rather than ratcheted up. So, really people just want to be heard. They just really want to be heard, and we need to hear them. We need to provide them the space to be heard in a safe way. So I too don't want police officers to be injured. It was awful to watch things thrown at police officers. 2 of them, were pretty seriously injured. We're still trying to figure out if those cases too will reside with me, and if we can figure out who is responsible for that. But, and then the looting and the property damage that occurred was just really disappointing. It was sad.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I'm sorry, Melinda. You got it.
A little different topic. A little more than a year ago, you talked about having a new way of dealing with domestic violence, which is such a huge problem here and elsewhere, obviously. That we were going to have this new to Kansas City system of focused deterrence. And honestly, every time I've asked about it since then, I've kind of heard, I'm not clear whether that's really happening. So I'd love to ask you right now, is that happening? How is it happening? Fill me in.
Yeah, we call that IPVI. It's the Intimate Partner of Violence Initiative that this office is leading. And we're doing it throughout Jackson County. So we're not just focusing on one jurisdiction or another. But so what we have done is we tried to do all the upfront work that we can to establish who are our domestic violence offenders and where do they fall? What category do they fall in? Because there's we're trying to follow the academic model of how you carry out the cases that we have against domestic abusers. So some of those are tier 1, where we call them A offenders, and those offenders are deemed like we have to separate them from their community. We have to separate them to let them know, hey, that's not behavior we're going to tolerate here. There are certain other levels though where there is a chance to make a real difference, and so we are working through some funding with that. I think we have put in a grant in the hopes that we can get funding so that we can have an academic partner with us on this venture. I think that's really important because I think prosecutors and police officers need that outside group to kind of steer us along, guide us, and also not let us get too far off of the path of how you are supposed to handle this, right? So it really is an academic model, and I really want to follow that. So we're moving, but we're not fully embedded yet.
So you're waiting on funding?
We're not waiting on the funding, though maybe I shouldn't want the world to know that because it's super, we want that grant. I want the academic partnership because we really do need that kind of guidance. Now, we have really tried to train ourselves and study ourselves and go to other jurisdictions and see how they do it so that we can follow that model. And we'll do it that way if we have to, on our own if we have to. But I really want, I want to, try and get, the academic component worked into our model.
How many of the most dangerous offenders have you, at that level 1, have you identified?
I don't have the list in front of me, Melinda, but I can, I know that we have drilled down on that information in the jurisdictions that we're focusing on. So that's been a partnership with police, the shelters, and other community providers and prosecutors. So we have drilled down on those issues.
Okay.
Prosecutor, I would be remiss if I did not ask you to chime in on the violent crime here in Kansas City, Missouri. Homicide rate is on a record pace. Clearance rate is low. What can your office do, and what can we do as a community to address violent crime in KC-Mo?
Oh, wow. So yes, you should ask me that question. Every time you talk to me, you should ask me that question. It is it's beyond discouraging to say where we are at this moment in time in Kansas City. We have surpassed the number of homicides today than we had in all of 2014, the entire year of 2014. During that period of time, we had, just as Melinda asked me about for domestic violence, we had a program called Kansas City's No Violence Alliance. That alliance was based off of focused deterrence. and we have since ended that program. I think if we went back to that, Toriano, that could really make a difference for us.
Now, when you say we have ended that program, who is we?
Well, the police department decided that they didn't want to be part of that effort anymore. They didn't believe that it was as effective as they wanted it to be. And so that was ended by them about a year and a half ago now. And I think the rates of violence have just continued to ebb up. But if we could go back to that kind of effort, it really is a true partnership with community. So it's not just law enforcement, it's not just prosecutors going out and doing this. It brings in community in a real way so that we can address the issues that are plaguing communities. So we're focusing our enforcement on the trigger pullers, who is doing the most violence. And for all those other things below, then we do this through social work. We try and show a different side of ourselves, that we really want to help you and we want to lift you up and we want to put you on a different path. That has worked in other cities, and it worked here because in 2014, the numbers showed that. It showed that it worked.
A lot of criticism has come my way about violence here, quote unquote, black on black crime. Now, when you look at the statistics, a lot of the trigger pullers, a lot of the victims are young black males, and that needs to be addressed. But there's a whole bunch of underlying issues that lead up to that. So my question to you is, how can we and you have the conversation about police reform, and also have a conversation about reducing gun violence, where it addresses all of those things?
It's all the same to me, Toriano. It is all absolutely the same. It doesn't fall in a different and separate bucket. It's all the same because it's about community trust. And if you can build that community trust, if we can find some baseline to build it back, I will guarantee you that homicide rates will go down and solve rate will go up. Because not only in 2014 did we have a low homicide rate, we had a phenomenal solve rate for those homicides, well over the national average, in the 70th percentile, above that actually. So it works and it goes hand in hand, and it's all the same thing. So it bothers me to hear people kind of point at, oh, well, black on black crime, there it is, we can't solve this thing. No, it's all the same thing.
If the police department stopped doing and stopped believing in focused deterrence on homicide, how on board are they on focused deterrence on domestic violence? And those two are related too. So maybe 20% of our homicides are domestic violence. All these issues are intertwined.
Well, I think domestic violence has a different buy-in. And so, and I can't explain why, but I do think it just has a different level of buy-in, not just by one police department, but by, all the departments that I deal with. And I think maybe we've traveled a long path regarding our own understanding of domestic violence victims. Once upon a time, we also blamed domestic violence victims, just like we blame shooting victims for getting shot. Sometimes once upon a time, we treated domestic violence victims with this notion, well, I'd only get hit once. I would never allow that to happen more than one time. But then we started training ourselves and understanding what that dynamic was and what this kind of the social fabric was and the psychology that is part and parcel of understanding that victimology. And then once we started doing that, we started addressing it more proactively and just frankly better. That's what needs to be done regarding all crimes, for non-fatal shooting victims, for homicide victims. We need to go there too.
Prosecutor, one of the great things about live technology is we are interactive, and we have a question from one of our audience members. So we're going to pop that on the screen, and we're going to ask this question. Oh, there it is. So relating to the protests in 2015 and 2016, a commenter says, Daryl Forte was the difference. He was willing to hear people. Richard Smith just wanted to show that he was the boss. Do you believe that?
Well, I don't know all of that yet. My job is to kind of take a step back and make sure that I am not having a knee-jerk reaction to things, but that I am actually studying. I'm going to take testimonials. I'm actually going to go talk to the old command staff that operated in 2015 and the command staff today, so I can understand what their decision-making was. And so I hope to know that someday soon.
Okay, and one more from my text line. You mentioned the trigger pullers. And you know, this is something that I've been saying to people all week, right? There's 80 plus homicides in Kansas City, Missouri. There's not 80 plus trigger men out here. It's not possible. So the reason why these trigger men are still walking the street, in my opinion, is because there's a lack of trust within the police department. So if I don't trust you to protect me and provide protection for me, why would I help you solve a crime? So if we get to community policing and we build that relationship with the police, then it's a partnership. And then not only is people emboldened, they're empowered, and they know they have the police protection. My thing is, if the police will protect witnesses to crime the way they protect the plaza during protests, we can get some of that clearance rate down. But that's my soapbox. The question is, you mentioned trigger pullers. How effective has that been going after the trigger pullers?
Well, I mean, in 2014, it was quite successful. We did well throughout 2015 until probably late August. Things started, we started losing our bottom again. But if you recall, our country was again largely on fire in 2015 because there was not just Michael Brown that had occurred the year before, but there was so many videos that came out. It's a repeat. 2015 today, it's a repeat. So I guess I would say, if we could have done it then, we can do it now.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time, and we want to thank you for stopping by. But before we go, what message can you, as Jackson County Prosecutor, give to the people of KC-Mo and Jackson County? What kind of word can you give them about this protest and what we need to do to get police reform here in this town?
Look, I would say it is your police department. Even though it is state controlled, it is your department. And this is your prosecutor's office. So your voice does matter. You should make it heard. And mostly to white people, don't go home yet. I mean, we have put on the backs of Black and brown people to carry this on their own for so long. It is time for us to stay in that game as well, and to make sure we're all in this together, that one is down, we're all down. And I speak to police officers as well. There's not a police officer that I know that would credibly defend bad police conduct. So you're on this team too. And we all, if we can start there, then we can get there. And I believe that about this city because I've seen it here before. We can get there again. I believe that.
And have you had a chance to reflect on some of the things that you have done and what you can do to tip the scales of balance in the justice system?
Yeah, look, I have a pretty deep resume of reform. And like I said, so much so that I am not the most popular person in law enforcement fields. And I understand that. So the next place that I'm going is to form this a community advisory board, because I think sometimes I make decisions too much just within these walls. And I need to broaden the scope of decision makers. Not that I'm looking for fall guys. I know that's me and it's my responsibility, but I want to be informed by as many community guardians as I can to help make good policy for this office and for the criminal justice system more broadly.
Thank you. Prosecutor, thank you for joining us today. Once again, I'm Toriano Porter, KC Star's editorial board. We have been Facebook Live with Melinda Henneberger and Jackson County Prosecutor Gene Peters Baker. Thank you for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Bye all.